This is Chapter 3 of Theosophy, a book by Rudolf Steiner. The Three Worlds. Number 1, the Soul World. We have seen that as human beings, we belong to three worlds. The substances and forces that build up our bodies are taken from the world of inanimate matter. We know about this world through the perceptions of our outer physical senses. Anyone who trusts these senses exclusively and develops only their kind of perception cannot gain access to the other two worlds, the soul and spiritual worlds. Whether or not we can persuade ourselves of the reality of any being or thing depends on our having an organ of perception, a sense for it. Of course, misunderstandings can easily arise when the higher organs of perception are referred to as spiritual, quote, senses, close quote, as they are here. When we speak about senses, we automatically think of something physical. We even call the physical world the sense world, in contrast to the spiritual world. In order to avoid misunderstanding, it must be emphasized that the term, quote, higher senses, close quote, is used here only figuratively and as a comparison. Just as our physical senses perceive what is physical, our soul and spiritual senses perceive what is of a soul and spiritual nature. The term sense will be used here only in its meaning of organ of perception. Without eyes that are sensitive to light, we would have no knowledge of light or of color, just as we would have no knowledge of sound without ears that are sensitive to it. In this connection, the German philosopher Lotze is perfectly justified in saying, quote, without a light-sensing eye, UIE, and a sound-sensing ear, the whole world would be dark and silent. It would be as impossible to have light and sound in it as it is to have a toothache without the pain-sensing nerve. Close quote, footnote, Rudolf Hermann Lotze, 1817 to 1881, physician and philosopher active in Leipzig, Göttingen, and Berlin, Grundzüge der Psychologie, Fundamentals of Psychology, Leipzig, 1894, page 19, end of footnote. To see all of this in the right light, we need only to imagine how different the world that we human beings know must appear to lower forms of animal life that possess only a sense of touch of a sort, spread out over the surface of their bodies. Light, color, and sound cannot possibly be present for them in the sense that they are for beings endowed with eyes and ears. The vibrations in the air set off by firing a gun, for example, may also have some effect on these animals if they are actually touched by them. But for these vibrations to register in the soul as a shot, an ear is necessary, just as an eye is necessary if certain processes taking place in the very fine matter we know as ether are to appear as light and color. We can know something about the nature of a being or thing only because it has an effect on one of our organs. This relationship between the human being and the world of realities is admirably expressed by Goethe, quote, in reality, any attempt to express the inner nature of a thing is fruitless. What we perceive are effects, and a complete record of these effects ought to encompass this inner nature. We labor in vain to describe a person's character, but when we draw together his actions, his deeds, a picture of his character will emerge. Colors are the deeds of light, what it does and what it endures. Although it is true that colors and light are intimately related to one another, we must consider both as belonging to all nature. Through them, nature in its entirety seeks to manifest itself, in this case, to the sense of sight, to the eye. Similarly, the whole of nature reveals itself to yet another sense. It speaks to other senses, which lie even deeper, to known, misunderstood, and unknown senses. Thus, it converses with itself, and with us through 1,000 phenomena. No one who is observant will ever find nature dead or silent. Close quote. Italics have been added. Footnote: Scientific Studies, Goethe. Editor and translator Douglas Miller, New York, Surkamp Publishers, 1988, page 158. End of footnote. Goethe's statement should not be interpreted as denying the possibility of understanding the essential nature of things. He does not mean that we perceive only the effects of things, while their true nature remains concealed behind these effects. Rather, he means that we should not talk about a concealed nature at all. The being is not behind its manifestation, but comes into view through its manifestation. However, this being may be so rich that it can disclose itself in other forms when appearing to other senses. What is disclosed does belong to the being in question, but because of the limitations of our senses, it is not the whole being. Goethe's view of this is the same as the spiritual scientific one presented here. Within our body, our eyes and ears develop as organs of perception, as senses for bodily processes. Similarly, we can develop soul and spiritual organs of perception that will open up soul and spirit worlds to us. For anyone who does not have such higher senses, these worlds are dark and silent, just as the physical world is dark and silent to a being without eyes and ears. However, we relate differently to these higher senses than to our physical ones, which as a rule are fully developed in us by good Mother Nature, without our doing anything about it. But we ourselves must work at developing our higher senses. Just as nature develops our physical body so that we can perceive our physical surroundings and orient ourselves in them, so we must cultivate our own soul and spirit if we want to perceive the soul and spirit worlds. There is nothing unnatural about cultivating the higher organs that nature itself has not yet developed, because, in a higher sense, everything that human beings accomplish also belongs to nature. Only those who contend that we should all stay at the level of development where nature left us could call developing these higher senses unnatural. For such people, these organs and their significance are misknown in Goethe's sense. Such people might as well oppose any and every kind of education for human beings, because that too goes beyond the work of nature, and should also be especially opposed to operating on anyone who is born blind. What happens to a blind person after a successful operation is very much like what happens to those who awaken their higher senses in the way described in the last section of this book. The world now appears to them full of new qualities, new processes, and new facts that their physical senses never revealed. They see clearly that there is nothing arbitrary or capricious about supplementing reality through these higher organs, and that without these organs, the essential part of this reality would have remained hidden from them. The soul and spirit worlds are not next to or outside the physical world, not separated from it in space. The formerly dark world is suddenly radiant with light and color for a person born blind who has undergone an operation. Similarly, the soul and spiritual qualities of things that until now had appeared to us only in a purely physical way are revealed when we are awakened in soul and spirit. Of course, this new world is also full of occurrences and beings that remain totally unknown to anyone who has not undergone a soul and spiritual awakening. Parenthesis, Later on in this book, the development of the soul and spiritual senses will be discussed in greater detail. But first, the higher worlds themselves will be described. Those who deny the existence of these worlds only demonstrate that they have not yet developed their own higher organs. Human development is never complete at any given level. It must always be taken further. Close parenthesis. We often tend, unintentionally, to imagine these higher organs as being too much like our physical ones. It is important to remember that these organs are soul or spiritual formations, and that we must not expect that what we perceive in the higher worlds to be only a misty and diluted form of material substance. As long as we expect anything of that sort, we will not come to a clear idea of what is actually meant here by higher worlds. Many people would find it much easier to actually know something, at first, of course, only the elementary facts, about these higher worlds, if they did not imagine that what they are to perceive is a highly refined version of something physical. That they make this assumption usually means that they do not want to recognize what is really involved. They find it unreal, do not accept it as something that could satisfy them, and so on. True, the higher levels of spiritual development are difficult to reach, but the levels adequate for recognizing the nature of the spiritual world, and that is already a lot, would not be nearly as difficult to reach if people would first get rid of the prejudice that makes them imagine that what is of a soul and spiritual nature is simply a more refined version of what is physical. We obviously do not really know a person if we have only an idea of his or her physical appearance, nor do we really know the world around us if we know only what our physical senses can tell us about it. A photograph becomes intelligible and full of life to us once we come to know the person in the photograph so well that we know his or her soul. And in the same way, we can really understand the material world only once we know its soul and spiritual basis. That is why it is good to talk first about the higher worlds of soul and spirit, and only then come to conclusions about the physical world from a spiritual scientific point of view. Certain difficulties are involved in talking about higher worlds at the present stage of civilization. The greatness of our age is due above all to its knowledge and mastery of the physical world. Our very words bear the stamp and meaning of the physical world, and yet using these ordinary words is our only possible link to what is familiar. This leaves the door wide open for misunderstanding by those willing to trust only their outer senses, since at first much can be expressed or indicated only through comparison and imagery. This, however, is how it has to be, because such images are a means of directing ourselves toward these higher worlds and fostering our eventual access to them. Parenthesis, we will speak about the ascent to higher worlds in a later chapter, in which the development of the soul and spiritual organs of perception will be discussed. Footnote, these spiritual organs of perception, also discussed briefly in a later chapter entitled The Path to Knowledge, are dealt with in greater detail in my books How to Know Higher Worlds and Esoteric Science. End of footnote. Indeed, to begin with, becoming aware of higher worlds by means of comparisons is exactly what we should be doing. Only then can we contemplate learning to see them for ourselves. Close parenthesis. Just as the substances and forces that constitute and govern our stomach, heart, lungs, brain, and other organs come from the material world, our soul qualities, our urges, desires, feelings, passions, wishes, sensations, and so on, come from the soul world. The human soul is a member of this soul world, just as the body is a part of the physical world. If we want to cite a preliminary difference between the physical and soul worlds, we can say that the latter is much finer, more mobile, and more malleable than the former. Meanwhile, of course, we have to realize that we are entering a totally new world when we come to the soul world, and that when we call things coarser or finer in this context, we are drawing comparisons between things that are actually fundamentally different. The same applies to everything we can say about the soul world using words borrowed from the physical. Taking this into consideration, we can say that the formations and beings of the soul world consist of soul substances and are guided by soul forces, just as is the case with physical substances and forces in the physical world. Just as occupation of space and movement within space are characteristic of physical forms, so are impelling desires and responsiveness to stimuli characteristic of the things and beings of the soul world. Thus, we can also call the soul world the world of desires, wishes, or longing. These expressions are all borrowed from the world of the human soul. So, we must keep in mind that in parts of the soul world, lying outside the human soul, things are as different from the soul forces within the human soul as the substances and forces of the outer physical world are from those that constitute the physical human body. Urge, wish, and longing are terms describing the soul world's material, which we will call astral substance. If we pay more attention to the soul world's forces, we can use the term, quote, desire being, close quote. But we must not forget that the distinction here between matter and force or energy cannot be as strict as it is in the physical world. An urge can just as well be called a force as a substance. These differences between the soul and physical worlds can be bewildering for anyone looking into the soul world for the first time. But the same is true when a previously inactive physical sense opens and starts to function. After eye operations, people who were born blind must also learn to orient themselves in a world they used to know only through the sense of touch. At first they see the objects as if these were actually in their eyes. Next they see them outside their eyes, but as if painted on a flat surface. Only gradually do they learn to perceive depth and the spatial distance between things. The laws, in effect, in the soul world are entirely different from the ones in effect in the physical world. Although, of course, many soul formations are linked to those of the other worlds, the human soul, for example, is linked to the human physical body and to the human spirit, and the processes observable in it are influenced by both the physical and spiritual worlds. We must take this into account when observing the soul world, and we must not make the mistake of attributing to a law of the soul world what is actually due to the influence of one of the other worlds. For example, when a wish proceeds from a human being, it is carried by a thought, a spiritual conception, whose laws it obeys. But just as we can establish what the laws of the physical world are by disregarding the influence human beings have on its processes, for example, we can do something similar with the soul world. We can express an important difference between soul and physical processes by saying that the interaction between soul processes is much more inward. In physical space, for instance, the law of impact is in effect. If a moving ivory ball strikes another one at rest, the second ball moves in a direction that can be calculated from the motion and elasticity of the first. In soul space, however, the interaction between two formations that meet depends on their inner attributes. If they are related, they interpenetrate and grow together, so to speak. If their essential natures are in conflict, they repel each other. To take another example, certain laws govern the way we see things in physical space. Distant objects appear reduced in size. When we look down a long tree-lined street, the trees in the distance, in accordance with the laws of perspective, appear closer together than the ones in the foreground. But in soul space, all things near and far appear to the observer at distances from one another that are determined by their inner nature. Of course, this can be a source of any number of errors for anyone who enters soul space and tries to get along using rules brought from the physical world. One of the first things we must learn in order to orient ourselves in the soul world is to distinguish the different types of formations, just as we distinguish between solid, liquid, and gaseous bodies in the physical world. To do this, we need to be aware of the two basic forces that are all important here, which may be called sympathy and antipathy. How these fundamental forces work within a soul formation determines its type. Sympathy is the force with which soul formations attract each other, try to merge with each other, and let their affinity take effect. Antipathy, on the other hand, is the force through which soul formations repel and exclude each other, and maintain their own identity. The role a soul formation plays in the soul world depends on the extent to which these basic forces are present in it. First, we must distinguish three types of soul formations on the basis of how sympathy and antipathy act in them. These types differ in their specific interrelationships of sympathy and antipathy, but both basic forces are present in all three. When we look at a soul formation of the first type, we find that it attracts other formations in its surroundings by means of the sympathy at work within it. But in addition to this sympathy, antipathy is also present at the same time, causing the formation to repel certain things in its surroundings. Seen from outside, this type of formation appears to possess only antipathetic forces, but that is not the case. Both sympathy and antipathy are present in it, but the latter is dominant. Formations like this play a self-centered role in soul space, repelling much of what surrounds them and lovingly attracting relatively little. Thus they move through soul space as unchangeable forms. The force of sympathy present in them makes them appear greedy, and their greed appears insatiable, as though it could never be satisfied, since their prevailing antipathy repels so much of what approaches them that no satisfaction can occur. If we were to compare soul formations of this type to something in the physical world, we might say that they correspond to the solid physical bodies. This region of soul substance can be called, quote, burning desire, close quote. The portion of this burning desire that is included in animal and human souls determines what we know as their lower sensual urges, their prevailing self-serving instincts. In the second type of soul formation, the two basic forces are held in balance. That is, sympathy and antipathy work equally strongly. Formations of this sort approach others with a certain neutrality, acting as if they were related, but without especially attracting or repelling them. They do not draw any fixed boundaries between themselves and their surroundings, so to speak, and constantly allow themselves to be influenced by other formations around them. For these reasons, they can be compared to fluid substances in the physical world. There is no trace of greed in the way such formations draw others toward them. The kind of activity meant here is evident, for instance, when the soul receives a sensation of color. If I have the sensation of a red color, I am receiving a stimulus from my surroundings, a stimulus that is neutral to begin with. Only when my liking for red is added to the stimulus does another soul activity enter the picture. The neutral stimulus is caused by soul formations in which a balanced interaction between sympathy and antipathy is maintained. We must describe the soul substance in question as totally malleable and flowing. When it moves through soul space, it is not self-centered like the first type. Its existence is constantly receptive to impressions, and it shows a relationship to much of what comes to meet it. Flowing sensitivity is a term that might be applied to this second type. In the third type of soul formations, sympathy predominates over antipathy. Antipathy brings about self-centered self-assertion. In this case, however, it takes second place to inclination toward things in the surroundings. We can imagine a formation like this in soul space. It appears as the center of a sphere of attraction reaching out over the objects in its surroundings. An appropriate term for these particular formations is, quote, wish substantiality, close quote. This seems to be the right designation because the effect of the antipathy present in them, although it is weaker than the sympathy, is to bring the objects the formation attracts into its own sphere of influence, thus giving the sympathy in it a fundamental note of self-seeking. This wish substantiality can be compared to airy or gaseous bodies in the physical world, since it spreads out in all directions, just as a gas naturally tries to expand on all sides. The higher levels of soul substance are characterized by the total withdrawal of one of the fundamental forces, namely antipathy. Only sympathy exhibits any effectiveness. It can now begin to assert itself within the parts of the soul formation so that these parts attract each other. The force of sympathy within a soul body comes to expression in what we call pleasure. Any reduction in sympathy is called displeasure. Displeasure is simply diminished pleasure, just as cold is diminished heat. Pleasure and displeasure constitute what lives in the world of feelings, in the narrower sense, within a human being. Feeling is the soul's weaving activity within itself, and what we call our comfort depends on how feelings of pleasure and displeasure mingle in our soul. A still higher level is occupied by the soul formations whose sympathy is not confined to the domain of their own lives. They, as well as the above-mentioned fourth level, differ from the three lower levels in that the force of sympathy no longer has any counteractive antipathy to overcome. Only through these higher forms of soul substance can the many different soul formations unite into a common soul world. As long as any antipathy is involved, a soul formation strives toward other things for the sake of its own life, in order to strengthen and enrich itself through the other. When antipathy is silent, the other is received as a revelation, as information. In soul space, this higher form of soul substance, plays a role similar to that of light in physical space. It causes one soul formation to absorb the being and essence of others for their own sake, or, as we might also put it, lets itself be shone upon by them. Soul beings first awaken to true soul life by drawing from these higher regions. Their subdued life in the darkness opens up to the outside and starts to shine and radiate out into soul space. Their dull and sluggish inner movement, which attempts to shut itself off by means of antipathy when only the substances of the lower regions are present, is transformed into power and mobility pouring out from within. The flowing sensitivity of the second region comes into effect only on contact when soul formations meet, in which case one flows over into the other. Actual contact is necessary here, but in the upper regions, a free outraying and outpouring is the rule. Parenthesis, it is quite justified to characterize the essence of this region as, quote, raying out, close quote, since the sympathy developed here works in such a way that this expression, derived from the working of light, can surely be used as its symbol, close parenthesis. A soul formation without the enlivening soul substances of the higher regions grows stunted like a plant in a dark cellar. Soul light, active soul power, and soul life itself, in the narrower sense, belong to these regions, and from here impart themselves to the soul beings. We must thus distinguish 3 lower and 3 upper regions of the soul world, and a 4th that mediates between them, yielding the following subdivision of the soul world. Region 1, region of burning desire. 2, region of flowing sensitivity. 3, region of wishes. 4, region of pleasure and displeasure. 5, region of soul light. 6, region of active soul power. 7, region of soul life. In the first 3 regions, soul formations receive their characteristic qualities from the inner relationship between antipathy and sympathy. In the 4th, sympathy moves and works within a soul formation itself. In the 3 highest regions, the force of sympathy becomes ever freer. The soul substances of these highest regions waft through soul space, enlightening and enlivening, awakening what would, if left to itself, lose itself in its own existence. Although it should be unnecessary to mention it by now, let us emphasize, for the sake of clarity, that these 7 divisions of the soul world do not represent distinct and separate areas. Just as solid, fluid, and gaseous substances intermingle in the physical world, burning desires, flowing sensitivity, and the forces of the world of wishes interpenetrate in the soul world. On the physical level, heat penetrates and light shines on bodies. In the soul world, the same thing happens with pleasure and displeasure, and with soul light. Something similar is also true of active soul power and soul life. Part 2. The soul in the soul world after death. The human soul is the connecting link between the human spirit and the human body. Its forces of sympathy and antipathy, which through their interplay bring about the soul's expressions of desire, sensitivity, wish, pleasure and displeasure, and so on, are not only active between soul formations, but also express themselves in relationship to the beings of the other worlds, the physical and the spiritual. While the soul is living in a body, It participates to some degree in everything that goes on in this body. When the functions of the physical body are proceeding smoothly, pleasure and comfort arise in the soul. But when these functions are disturbed, displeasure and pain appear. But the soul also takes part in the spirit's activities. One thought fills it with joy, another with disgust. It applauds a correct judgment and disapproves of a false one. A person's level of development depends on whether his or her soul leans more in the one direction or in another. Individuals are the more nearly perfect, the more their souls sympathize with manifestations of the Spirit, and, the less perfect, the more their soul's inclinations are satisfied through bodily functions. The Spirit is at the center of each human being, and the body is the instrument through which the Spirit observes and knows, and also acts in the physical world. The soul, however, mediates between the two. For example, it releases the sensation of tone from the physical impressions that air vibrations make on the ear, and then it experiences pleasure in this tone. It imparts all this to the Spirit, which grows in its understanding of the physical world as a result. A thought that appears in the Spirit is converted by the soul into the wish to bring the thought into being, and only then, with the help of the bodily instrument, can the thought become an accomplished deed. We human beings can live up to our calling only by letting all of our activity be directed by the Spirit. Left to itself, the soul can as easily turn its inclinations toward the physical world as toward the spiritual. Its, quote, feelers, close quote, so to speak, extend down into the physical as well as up into the spirit. Through this extension into the physical world below, the soul's own essential being is permeated and colored by the nature of this physical world. And since the spirit can only work in the physical world by means of the soul's mediation, the spirit itself points in the direction of the physical. Its formations are drawn toward the physical through the forces of the soul. Death is a fact of the physical world that signifies a change in the functioning of the body. At death, the body ceases to be a vehicle for a soul and a spirit, and from then on its functions become totally subject to the physical world and physical laws. It passes into the physical world in order to disintegrate in it. Our physical senses can observe only what happens to the body after death. What happens to the soul and spirit eludes them. Even when a person is alive, the soul and spirit can be observed only to the extent that they take on an outer manifestation in physical processes. After death, this is no longer possible. Therefore, sciences based on physical sense perception do not apply to the destiny of the soul and spirit after death. At this point, a higher form of knowledge appears, a knowledge based on the observation of processes taking place in the soul and spirit worlds. After freeing itself from the body, the spirit is still linked to the soul. Just as the body bound it to the physical world during physical life, the soul now binds it to the soul world. But the spirit's ultimate being is not to be found in this soul world, whose purpose is only to link it to its field of activity, to the physical world. To be able to reappear in more perfected form in a new incarnation, the spirit must draw energy and strength from the spiritual world. Through the soul, however, the spirit has been entangled in the physical world, bound up with a soul being permeated and colored by physical nature. And it also took on this orientation itself. After death, the soul is no longer bound to the body, but only to the spirit. It then lives in a soul environment, and only the forces of this soul world can influence it. To begin with, the spirit is bound to the soul's life in the soul world, just as it was bound to the body during physical incarnation. The moment of the body's death is determined by the body's own laws. In general, the soul and spirit do not leave the body. It is rather dismissed by them when its forces can no longer function as the human physical organization requires. Footnote, publisher's note. This passage reads, quote, "They are rather dismissed by it," close quote, in the 19th through the Stuttgart 1922 through the 26th Stuttgart 1948 editions. In all editions since the 27th Stuttgart 1955, the wording of the 1st through 18th editions has been restored. It is not certain that the changes introduced in 1922 stem from the author, so both versions have been presented here. End of footnote. The same thing applies to the relationship between soul and spirit. The soul will release the spirit into the higher world, the spiritual world, when the soul's forces no longer function as the human soul organization requires. The spirit is set free as soon as the soul surrenders to dissolution everything it can experience only in the body, and retains only what is able to live on with the spirit. This remainder, although experienced in the body, can be imprinted on the spirit as the fruits of a lifetime, and links the soul to the spirit in the purely spiritual world. To become familiar with the soul's fate after death, we must observe the process of its dissolution. Its task had been to orient the spirit toward the physical, and as soon as this task is fulfilled, the soul itself moves in the direction of the spiritual. Because of the nature of its task, it would actually be immediately obliged to be only spiritually active once the body falls away from it, and it can no longer be a connecting link. This would happen if the soul had not been influenced by the body for a whole lifetime, and had not been drawn toward the body in its own inclinations. Without the coloring it assumed through being bound up with the body, the newly disembodied soul would immediately start to obey only the laws of the spirit and soul world. This would be the case if the person in question had lost all interest in the earthly world before dying, if all the desires, wishes, and so on linking that individual to the physical existence left behind had been satisfied. But to the extent that this is not the case, what remains of this orientation clings to the soul. To avoid confusion at this point, we must clearly distinguish between something that binds a person to the world in a way that can be resolved in a future incarnation, and something that binds that individual to one particular incarnation, namely the most recent one. In the first case, the situation is resolved by karma. In the second, it can only be discarded by the soul after death. For the human spirit, death is followed by a time in which the soul strips itself of its inclinations toward physical existence, so that it can, once again, obey only the laws of the spirit and soul worlds, and can set the spirit free. Of course, this takes longer in cases where the soul has been more tightly bound to the physical. It takes little time in cases of individuals who have not been very attached to physical life. Longer in cases of those whose interests were totally bound up with that life, and who therefore still have many desires, wishes, and so on present in their souls at death. Gaining an idea of the state in which the soul lives during the time right after death will be easiest if we take a fairly crass example. For instance, the pleasure of a gourmet. This pleasure, of course, is not of the body, but of the soul. In that, both the pleasure and the desire for this pleasure belong to the soul. However, satisfying this desire requires the corresponding bodily organs, palate, taste buds, and so on. After death, the soul does not immediately lose its desire, but the physical organs that used to be the means of satisfying it are no longer there. The person in question then experiences something similar to suffering from extreme thirst in an area where there is no water for miles around. Parenthesis, although the reason for the suffering is different, its effects are similar, but much stronger. Close parenthesis. Because of the lack of the physical organs through which pleasure was experienced, the soul suffers burning pain at being deprived of this pleasure. The same applies to any of the soul's desires that can be satisfied only by means of physical organs. This state of burning deprivation can be called, quote, the place of desires, close quote, although, of course, it is not an actual place. It lasts until the soul has learned to stop craving what can be provided only by the body. When the soul enters the soul world after death, it is subject to the laws that prevail there, and their effects determine how the soul's inclination toward the physical will be eliminated. The effects will have to be different according to the types of soul, substances, and forces involved, but each type will make its cleansing and purifying influence felt. The process is such that any antipathy in the soul is gradually overcome by the forces of sympathy, and the sympathy itself is taken to the ultimate degree. At this highest level of sympathy toward all the rest of the soul world, an individual soul merges with the rest, so to speak, becomes one with it, its self-seeking exhausted. It ceases to exist as a being inclined toward physical sensory existence. And through this, the spirit is set free. The soul undergoes purification in all the regions of the soul world described previously, until in the region of perfect sympathy it becomes one with the soul world in general. Because the spirit has spent a lifetime in intimate association with the soul, it is bound to it until the very last moment of liberation. Having been directly linked to the soul, which was its very life, the spirit is much more closely related to it than to the body, to which it was linked only indirectly through the soul. The spirit is bound to the soul that is gradually freeing itself, but not to the disintegrating body. Because it has a direct link to the soul, the spirit can only feel free of the soul once the soul has become one with the soul world in general. As the human being's residence during the time immediately after death, the soul world can be called the, quote, place of desires, close quote. The different religious systems that have incorporated an awareness of this situation into their teachings know this place of desires under different names, such as, quote, purgatory, close quote, the fire of purification, close quote, and so on. The soul world's lowest region is the region of burning desire, where the soul's crudest, self-serving desires, those relating to the lowest aspect of bodily life, are eliminated after death. Through such desires, the soul can experience the effect of this region's forces. These forces take as their point of attack all the unfulfilled desires that remain in the soul from physical life. The sympathy in such a soul extends only to what will nourish its own self-seeking being, and is far outweighed by the antipathy in it which pours out over anything else. However, after death, its desires focus on physical pleasures that cannot possibly be satisfied in the soul world, and this impossibility intensifies its greed to the greatest possible degree. At the same time, however, this impossibility gradually extinguishes the greed. The burning lusts and desires slowly consume themselves, and the soul learns from experience that eliminating these lusts is the only way to prevent the suffering that must stem from them. During physical life, such desires are repeatedly satisfied, effectively concealing the pain of burning greed behind a kind of illusion. After death, however, in the fire of purification, this pain is fully exposed, and the corresponding deprivation must be suffered to the full. This is indeed a dark state of affairs for the soul. Of course, only individuals whose desires focused on the coarsest things in physical life fall into this state. Those with few desires, on the other hand, have little connection to the region of burning desire, and pass through it without noticing it. It must be stated that the souls spending the longest time under the influence of this region are those who became most related to its fire during physical life, and therefore have the greatest need to be purified in it. Since the soul actually longs for its own purification after death, we should not regard this purification as suffering in the sense of any comparable experience in the world of the senses. It is the only way the imperfection remaining in the soul can be eliminated. Processes of a second type take place in the soul world, processes in which sympathy and antipathy are in balance. A human soul, in this condition, will be influenced after death by these processes for a period of time determined by the extent to which it gave itself in life to superficial frivolities, to the pleasures of transitory sense impressions, and to the influence of daily trivialities that typify this condition. People live in this condition as long as they are affected by inclinations of this sort. They let themselves be influenced by every daily triviality. But the influences fade quickly, since their sympathy is not extended to any one thing in particular. Anything not belonging to this trivial realm is antipathetic to them. After death, when a soul in this condition lacks the sense-perceptible physical things needed for satisfaction, the condition must slowly die off. Naturally, the deprivation that prevails before it is fully extinguished in the soul causes suffering. In the school of this suffering, we learn to destroy the illusions in which we wrapped ourselves during physical life. Processes of a third type in the soul world are those in which sympathy and a wish-like character prevail. Our souls experience the effects of these processes through everything that maintains an atmosphere of wishing after death. This wishing, too, gradually dies off because of the impossibility of satisfying it. The region of pleasure and displeasure in the soul world, designated above as the fourth region, subjects the soul to special trials. As long as the soul occupies a body, it takes part in everything that affects that body, such as the interweaving of pleasure and displeasure that determines the body's comfort and well-being, its discomfort and displeasure. During physical life, a human being feels the body to be the self, the basis of individual identity. The more sensuous a person's inclinations are, the more his or her feeling of identity takes on this character. After death, however, although the feeling of identity persists, the body that was its object is gone. And as a result, the soul feels hollow and empty, as if it had lost itself. This lasts until the recognition dawns that the true human being is not physical in nature. Thus, the effects of this fourth region destroy the illusion of the bodily self. The soul learns to no longer perceive this bodily basis as essential, and is purified and cured of its attachment to bodily existence, overcoming what used to bind it so strongly to the physical world. It can now fully unfold the forces of sympathy which move outward. The soul has broken free from itself, as it were, and is ready to pour itself actively into the soul world in general. At this point, we should note that suicides, having left their bodies by artificial means, while the feelings bound up with their bodies remain unchanged, undergo the experiences of this region to an exceptional degree. When death is due to natural causes, the disintegration of the body is accompanied by the partial demise of the emotions that cling to it. But for suicides, in addition to the anguish caused by feeling suddenly hollowed out, all the unsatisfied desires and wishes that prompted them to undergo disembodiment in the first place are still present. The fifth level of the soul world is the level of soul light. Here, sympathy for others already carries considerable weight. Souls are related to this region to the extent that they took joy and pleasure in their surroundings during physical life, rather than giving themselves up to satisfying their lower needs. What undergoes purification here includes, for instance, a sensuous over-enthusiasm for nature, which must be distinguished from a loftier living in nature that is spiritual in character and seeks the spirit that reveals itself in the things and processes of nature. This higher feeling for nature is among the things that contribute to the development of the spirit and establish something permanent in it. This must be distinguished from a sense-based pleasure in nature, which leaves the soul in need of purification as much as any other inclinations based on purely physical existence do. Many people idealize practical arrangements that serve our sensuous well-being, such as a system of education that leads to sensuous comfort above all else. We cannot say that these people are serving only their own self-centered impulses. Nevertheless, their souls are still oriented to the sense-perceptible world, and must be cured of this tendency by means of the power of sympathy that prevails in the fifth region of the soul world, where any external means of satisfaction is lacking. Here, the soul gradually recognizes that this sympathy must take other directions. Sympathy for its soul surroundings must prompt the soul to pour itself out into soul space. Those souls who expect their religious observances to enhance their sensuous well-being are also purified here, regardless of whether they yearn for an earthly or for a heavenly paradise. They find this paradise in the soul world, but only in order to recognize its worthlessness. Of course, these are all only individual examples of purifications undergone in this fifth region. many more could be added. The purification of the part of the soul that thirsts for action takes place in the 6th region, or region of active soul power. Although this action is not egotistical in character, it is still motivated by the sensuous satisfaction that it provides. The kinds of people who develop this pleasure in activity give the outward appearance of being idealists and self-sacrificing individuals, but on a deeper level, they are still motivated by the heightening of sensuous pleasure. Many artistic people, as well as those who devote themselves to scientific activity for the pleasure of it, belong in this region. What binds them to the physical world is their belief that art and science exist for the sake of such pleasure. The 7th region, that of the actual soul life, frees us from our last inclinations toward the sensory physical world. Each preceding region has absorbed that aspect of the soul that is related to it. All that is left surrounding the spirit is the belief that its activity should be totally devoted to the physical world. Many extremely gifted people think about little else than events in the physical world. Their persuasion can be called materialism. In the 7th region, these beliefs must be and are destroyed. Our souls realize that in actual reality, a materialistic point of view is without object, and their materialistic beliefs melt away like ice in the sun. The being of the soul is now absorbed into its own world, and the spirit, free of all restraints, wings its way upward into regions in which it lives only in its own element. The soul has completed its most recent earthly task, and in the time that has elapsed since death, any aspects of this task remaining as bonds for the spirit have dissolved. In overcoming this last earthly remnant, the soul is returned to its own element. From what has been described, we can see that experiences in the soul world and the circumstances of soul life after death become less and less repellent as we dispose of more and more of what still clings to us from our earthly union with and affinity for material existence. Depending on the circumstances created during its physical life, a soul will belong to the different regions for longer or shorter periods of time. Wherever it feels an affinity, it remains until the affinity is wiped out. But where no affinity exists, it passes through without feeling any of the possible effects. This section was intended to describe in broad strokes only the most basic features of the soul world and the nature of the soul's life within it. The same is true of the following description of the country of spirit beings. To describe further characteristics of these higher worlds would go beyond the limits of this book. Without going into very great detail, the phenomena in these higher worlds that can be compared to spatial relationships and time spans cannot be discussed in an intelligible way, since these are all quite different from their counterparts in the physical world. Some important points on this subject are included in my Esoteric Science. Part 3. The Country of Spirit Beings. Before we can follow the spirit as it continues its journey, we must first look at the territory it is entering. This is the world of the spirit, and it is so different from the physical world that everything we have to say about it will seem sheer fantasy to those willing to trust only their physical senses. We had to use comparisons and imagery to describe the soul world, and that is even more the case here. Our language, which for the most part serves only the purposes of sense-perceptible reality, is not exactly richly endowed with expressions that can be applied directly to the country of spirit beings, in quotes. So it is especially important to take much of what is said here as nothing more than indications. Since everything described here is so different from the physical world, this is the only possible way of depicting it at all. Because of the inadequacy of our language, which is intended for communication in the physical world, the statements being made here can only crudely correspond to actual experience in the spiritual field. It must be emphasized above all that this spiritual world is woven out of the substance that constitutes human thought. Substance, in quotes, in a very figurative sense, of course. But thought, as it appears in human beings, is only a shadowy image of, or phantom, of its real being. A thought appearing by means of a human brain corresponds to a being in the country of spirit beings, as a shadow on the wall corresponds to the actual object casting the shadow. But when our spiritual senses are awakened, we actually perceive the thought being itself, just as our physical eyes perceive a table or a chair. We are surrounded and accompanied by thought beings. Our physical eyes perceive a lion, and our sense-oriented thinking perceives the idea of the lion merely as a phantom, a shadowy image. But in the country of spirit beings, the idea of the lion is as real and visible to our spiritual eyes as the physical lion is to our physical eyes. The comparison we used in connection with the soul world is also pertinent. Just as people who were born blind, but have had their sight restored through operations, suddenly perceive their surroundings as having the new qualities of color and light, those who have learned to use their spiritual eyes perceive their surroundings as filled with a whole new world of living thoughts or spirit beings. The first things to be seen in this world are the spiritual archetypes of all the things and beings that exist in the physical and soul worlds. If you imagine a painting as existing in the spiritual world before the artist paints it, you will have an image of what is meant by the term archetype. That the painter may not have this archetype in mind before starting to paint, that he may only come to it gradually as the painting is actually being worked on, is beside the point. In the spiritual world, these archetypes exist for all things. Physical things and beings are copies or imitations of their archetypes. Quite understandably, people who trust only their outer senses will deny the existence of this archetypal world and insist that archetypes are only abstractions that the intellect works out by comparing sense-perceptible things. Such people cannot perceive at all in this higher world. They are aware of the world of thoughts only in its shadowy abstractness. They do not know that individuals capable of spiritual vision are as familiar with spirit beings as they themselves are with their dogs or cats, and that the reality of the archetypal world is actually much more intense than physical sense-perceptible reality. It is true that looking into this country of spirit beings for the first time is even more confusing than looking into the soul world, because archetypes in their true forms are very unlike their sense-perceptible copies, and they bear equally little resemblance to their shadows, our abstract thoughts. In the spiritual world, everything is in constant activity, constant motion, constant creation. Resting, in quotes, or staying in one place, in quotes, does not exist there as it does in the physical world. simply because the archetypes are creative beings, the master builders of everything that comes into existence in the physical and soul worlds. Their forms change quickly, and each archetype has the potential to assume countless specific forms. Footnote: although it is true that, quote, there is no such thing in the spiritual world as resting or staying in place, as there is in the physical world, it would be incorrect to assume that the spiritual world is a place of constant unrest. In this world where, quote, the archetypes are creative beings, close quote, although there is nothing that can be called, quote, resting in one place, close quote, there is a peace of a spiritual kind that is totally compatible with active mobility. The spiritual equivalent of rest is peaceful contentment and bliss manifesting in activity rather than inactivity. Close quote. End of footnote. It is as if the specialized forms well up out of them. One form has hardly been created before its archetype is ready to let the next one pour out. In addition, archetypes do not work alone, but stand in closer or more distant relationship to each other. One archetype may need the help of another to do its creating, and often innumerable archetypes work together so that some particular being can come to life in the soul world or the physical world. In addition to what can be perceived by means of spiritual sight in the country of spirit beings, the experience of spiritual hearing must also be taken into account. For as soon as a clairvoyant ascends from the soul world into the spirit, the archetypes also begin to resound. This resounding is a purely spiritual process that must be conceived of without any thought of physical sound. To an observer, it is like being in an ocean of sounds and tones in which the beings of the spiritual world are expressing themselves. Their interrelationships and the archetypal laws of their existence reveal themselves in the chords, harmonies, rhythms, and melodies of this spiritual music, which reveals to our spiritual ear what reasoning in the physical world perceives as an idea or natural law. Hence the Pythagoreans called this perception of the spiritual world, quote, the music of the spheres, close quote. To those with functioning spiritual ears, this music of the spheres is no symbol or allegory, but a familiar spiritual reality. To acquire an idea of this spiritual music, we must dispense with all our sensory concepts of music as we perceive it by means of our material ears. Spiritual perception is involved here, perception of a sort that remains silent for the physical ear. For simplicity's sake, all references to spiritual music will be omitted in the following descriptions of the country of spirit beings. We must imagine, however, that everything described as an image, as quote-unquote shining or radiant, is also sounding. Every color, every sensation of light corresponds to a spiritual tone. Every interaction among colors corresponds to a harmony or a melody, and so on. We must keep in mind that spiritual seeing does not cease where spiritual sound prevails. The sounding simply augments the radiance. And where archetypes or archetypal images are mentioned, we need to imagine primal tones as well. Other modes of perception that could be called spiritual tasting, and so on, are also involved. But we will not go into these processes now, since the point is simply to alert us to a conception of the spiritual world, taking certain modes of perception as examples. First of all, we need to be able to distinguish between different kinds of archetypes. Here in the country of spirit beings, as in the soul world, there are a number of different levels or regions that we must be able to differentiate in order to orient ourselves. Here, too, these individual regions are to be imagined as if interpenetrating rather than layered or piled on top of one another. The first region contains the archetypes of things in the physical world that are not endowed with life. The archetypes of minerals are to be found here, and those of plants, but only to the extent that they are purely physical. That is, to the extent that they do not take their inherent life into account. In the same way, we also find the physical forms of animals and human beings here. This is not an exhaustive list of what is to be found in this first region, but only a few illustrative examples. This region constitutes the basic structure of the country of spirit beings, and can be compared to the solid land masses of our physical earth. It is the continental mass of this spirit country. Of course, its relationship to the physical bodily world can be described only by means of comparisons. We can get some idea of it as follows. Imagine a finite space filled with a wide variety of physical bodies. Then imagine that the physical bodies are gone, and visualize hollow spaces of the same shapes in their places. Imagine that what used to be the empty spaces between the bodies is filled with a wide variety of forms that relate to the former bodies in many different ways. This is somewhat similar to how things appear in the lowest region of the world of archetypes. Things and beings that are embodied in the physical world exist as hollow spaces here, and the mobile activity of the archetypes and the spiritual music goes on in between them. When the time comes for physical embodiment, the hollow spaces are then filled in with matter, so to speak. Anyone looking into space with both physical and spiritual eyes would see physical bodies, and among them the mobile activity of the creative archetypes. The second region of the country of spirit beings contains the archetypes of life, but here this life forms a perfect unity. It streams through the spiritual world like a fluid element, and is similar to blood in how it pulses through everything. It could be likened to the physical world's oceans and other bodies of water, although its distribution more closely resembles that of the blood in animal bodies than that of oceans and rivers. This second level of the country of spirit beings might be described as, quote, flowing life formed from thought substance, close quote. In this element are the creative archetypal forces for everything that appears in physical reality as enlivened being. It is apparent here that all life is a unity, that the life within us as human beings is related to the life of all our fellow creatures. The archetypes of everything of a soul nature make up the third region of the country of spirit beings. Here we are in a much thinner and finer element than in the first two regions, in an element that can be described, figuratively speaking, as the atmosphere of this country of spirit beings. Everything taking place in souls, in the two other worlds, has its spiritual counterpart here. All sensations, feelings, instincts, passions, and so on are also present here once again, but in spiritual form. The atmospheric processes taking place in this air, in quotes, corresponds to the sorrows and joys of creatures in the other worlds. The longing of a human soul appears as a light breeze, a passionate outbreak as a stormy blast. Those capable of visualizing what is going on here can penetrate deeply into the sighs of any ensouled being if they turn their attention to it. Here, for example, we can talk about thunderstorms with flashing lightning and rolling thunder. If we pursue the matter further, we find that these spiritual storms express the passions of battles being fought on earth. The archetypes of the fourth region do not relate directly to the other worlds. In a certain respect, these archetypes are beings that govern the archetypes of the three lower regions and mediate their coming together, ordering and grouping them. It follows that the activity proceeding from this region is more encompassing than that of the lower regions. The fifth, sixth, and seventh regions are fundamentally different from the previous ones, because the beings at home in them provide the archetypes of the lower regions with the impulses required for their activity. There, the creative forces of the archetypes themselves are to be found. When we can ascend as high as these three regions, we become acquainted with the quote-unquote intentions underlying our world. Footnote: terms like intention are used here in a metaphorical sense, as will be obvious from previous discussion of the difficulties involved in expressing these things through language. Reviving the old teleological, quote, doctrine of purpose, close quote, is not what is intended. The terms purposes and intentions must be used here with regard to the driving forces behind world evolution, even though this makes it tempting to misinterpret these powers in terms of purposes or intentions on the human level. This temptation can be avoided only by raising these words to a new level of meaning, where they can be free of anything that would restrict them to the merely human level, and can assume a meaning we human beings approach in those moments in our lives when we transcend ourselves to a certain extent. The end of footnote. The archetypes lie ready here like germinal points of life, waiting to assume the various forms of thought beings. When these germinal points are projected into the lower regions, they immediately well up and manifest in the most varied forms. The ideas through which the human spirit appears creatively in the physical world are reflections or shadows of these germinal thought beings of the higher spiritual world. On ascending from the lower regions of spirit country to these upper ones, observers possessing the, quote, spiritual ear, close quote, become aware that sounds and tones are transformed into spiritual language. They begin to perceive the, quote, spiritual word, close quote, through which objects and beings communicate their nature, not only in music, but also in words, speaking out what can be called in spiritual science their, quote, eternal names, close quote. Footnote: Esoteric Science, his book, contains more on the subject of the spiritual word. End of footnote. We must imagine these germinal thought beings as composite in nature. Only the germ sheath, which surrounds the actual life kernel of these beings, is taken from the elements of the world of thoughts. At this point, we arrive at the limits of the three worlds. Since the life kernel itself has its origin in still higher worlds. When, in an earlier chapter, we considered the human being as made up of various component members, this life kernel was described, and its parts called the, quote, life spirit, close quote, and, quote, spirit body, close quote. Other cosmic beings also have similar life kernels that originate in higher worlds and are moved into the three we have discussed in order to perform their tasks there. At this juncture, we will follow the human spirit as it continues its pilgrimage through spirit country between two incarnations or embodiments. As we do so, the circumstances and distinctive characteristics of this country will once again become clear to us. Part 4. The Spirit in Spirit Country after Death. Once a human spirit has passed through the world of souls on its journey between two incarnations, it enters the country of spirits, where it remains until it is ready for a new bodily existence. We can understand the meaning of this stay in spirit country only if we are able to interpret properly the purpose of our life's pilgrimage in an incarnation. While we are incarnated in physical bodies, we human beings work and create in the physical world. But we work and create as spiritual beings. What we imprint on physical forms, materials, and forces, our spirits think out and develop. Our task as messengers of the spiritual world is to incorporate the spirit into the material world. Only through incarnating in physical bodies can we work in the material world. We must take on physical bodies as our tools, so that we have something material through which to work on the material world, and through which the material world can work on us. However, what works through our human bodily nature is the spirit. The intentions and directions for our work in the material world come from the spirit. As long as the spirit is active in a physical body, it cannot work in its true form as spirit, but can only shine through the veil of physical existence, so to speak. In reality, our human thought life belongs to the spiritual world, but as it appears within our physical existence, its true form is veiled. We might also say that the thought activity of physical human beings is a shadowy image, a reflection of the true spiritual being to which it belongs. During physical life, the spirit interacts with the earthly material world by using a material body as its basis. It is true that one of the tasks of the human spirit, as long as this spirit is proceeding from incarnation to incarnation, is to work in the physical world. But this task could not be completed appropriately if the spirit lived only an embodied existence. The intentions and goals of an earthly task are no more worked out and determined within an earthly incarnation than the blueprint for a building comes about on the site where the builders are already at work. The plan for the building is worked out in the architect's office, and the goals and intentions of earthly endeavor are developed in the country of spirits, where each human spirit must dwell again and again between incarnations in order to equip itself for work in a physical lifetime. The architect draws up the plan for a house in the office according to architectural and other standards, and does this without touching actual bricks and mortar. Similarly, the architect of human creativity, the spirit, or higher self, develops the necessary goals and capabilities according to the laws of the country of spirit beings, in order to then send them into the earthly world. Only by returning again and again to its own realm will a human spirit be able to bring the spirit into the earthly world by means of its physical material instrument. In the physical arena, we learn to know the characteristics and forces of the physical world. While working, we gather experience about what the physical world requires of those who want to work in it. We also learn to know the characteristics of the matter we intend to use to embody our thoughts and ideas, although these ideas and thoughts themselves cannot be derived from matter. Thus the physical world is the setting for both work and learning. Afterward, in spirit country, what has been learned is transformed into the active abilities and capacities of the human spirit. To make things clearer, the comparison we used above can be taken further. An architect works out a design for a house, and this plan is carried out. In the process, the architect gains experience in a number of ways, so that his or her capabilities are enhanced. When the next design has to be drawn up, all these experiences flow into it. The second design is enriched by everything learned in the process of carrying out the first. It is the same with successive human lifetimes. In the intervals between incarnations, the spirit is at home in its own realm, and is able to devote itself totally to the requirements of spiritual life. Released from physical existence, it develops in all directions and incorporates the fruits of its experience in previous lifetimes into this process. Its attention is thus always directed to the earthly context of its tasks. To the extent that the earth is the spirit's field of action, the spirit is constantly working to keep pace with the earth's evolution, and is working on itself so that in each incarnation the service it performs corresponds to the earth's situation at that time. Of course, this is only a very general picture of successive human lifetimes. Reality never conforms totally to this picture, but only approximates it. Circumstances can dictate that a person's next life is much less perfect than the preceding one, but on the whole, these irregularities are balanced out within precise limits in successive incarnations. The course of our spirit's development in the country of spirit beings takes place through our becoming fully involved in the life of each of its different regions. Our own life dissolves into each region in succession. We temporarily assume the characteristics of each of these regions. As a result, their being permeates our being, so that we are strengthened in our work on earth. In the first region of the country of spirit beings, we are surrounded by the spiritual archetypes of earthly things. During our earthly lifetime, we only learn to know the shadows of these archetypes, which we grasp in our own thoughts. What is merely thought on earth is experienced in this region. We are surrounded by thoughts as we proceed on our way, but these thoughts are real beings. What we perceived through our senses during earthly life now works on us in its thought form. But the thought appears to us not as a shadow hiding behind the things, but as a living reality that creates the things. We are in the thought workshop, so to speak, where earthly things are shaped and formed. Everything in the country of spirits is full of lively activity and movement. Here, the thought world is at work as a world of living beings, creating and forming. We see here how what we experienced during earthly existence is shaped and formed. In our physical bodies, we experience sense-perceptible things as realities, but now, as spirits, we experience spiritual formative forces as real. Also present among the thought beings here is the idea of our own physical bodily nature, from which we now feel quite removed. We experience only our spiritual being as actually belonging to us. When we do become aware, as if in memory, of the body we have laid aside, we see it no longer as a physical being, but rather as a thought being, and then the fact that it belongs to the outer world becomes a direct observation. We learn to regard it as something belonging to the outer world, as an extension of the outer world. As a result, we no longer consider our own physical existence to be more closely related to ourselves, so we cease to separate it from the rest of the world. We experience the entire outer world, including our own physical embodiments, as a unity. Our personal physical embodiments merge into a unity with the rest of the world. At this stage, we view the archetypes of physical bodily reality as a unity to which we ourselves once belonged. Through observation, we gradually learn to recognize our relationship to, our unity with, our surroundings, to realize that we ourselves once were what is spread out around us here. This is one of the fundamental ideas of ancient Indian Vedanta wisdom. The sage acquires, during earthly life, what other people experience only after death, namely the ability to grasp the thought that we ourselves are related to all things, the thought, quote, "that is you," close quote. In earthly life, this is an ideal that our thinking can aspire to. But in the country of spirit beings, it is an immediate fact that it becomes ever clearer as we gain spiritual experience. We become ever more aware that in our essential being we belong to the spiritual world. We perceive ourselves as spirits among spirits, as organs of the primal spirits. We feel in ourselves their word, quote, "I am the primal spirit," close quote, or, in the terms of Vedanta wisdom, quote, "I am Brahman," close quote. That is, I am part of, an organ of, the primal being from which all beings spring. Thus we see that what we grasp during earthly life as a shadowy idea, and the object of all wisdom's aspiration, is a matter of direct experience in the spirit world. This idea can be thought during earthly life only because it is an actual fact in spiritual existence. During spiritual existence, we see the relationships and circumstances that surrounded us during earthly life from a more elevated vantage point, as if from outside. While we live in the spirit country's lowest region, this is how we relate to earthly circumstances having to do directly with physical bodily reality. We are born on earth into a family and an ethnic group, and we live in a particular country. All these circumstances determine our earthly existence. We find that the circumstances in the physical world cause us to become friends with particular people or to pursue a particular line of work. They determine the general character of our life. In the first region of the country of spirit beings, all this confronts us as a living thought entity. In a certain sense, we live through it all again, but from the active spiritual side. Our love for our family and the friendship we extended to others are now enlivened in us from within. and our capacities in this direction are enhanced. What works in the human spirit as the force of love, of family and friends is strengthened, and in this respect we later enter earthly existence as more perfected human beings. For the most part, our daily relationships in earthly life are what ripen into fruit in this lowest region of the country of spirit beings. The aspect of the human being that in its interests is wholly bound up with these daily circumstances will feel related to this region for the greatest portion of the spiritual life between incarnations. The people with whom we lived in the physical world are encountered again in the spiritual world. Just as everything that the soul once possessed through the physical body falls away, so does the bond that once linked soul to soul in physical life free itself from the circumstances that only had meaning and reality in the physical world. But what one soul was to another in physical life lives on after death, lives on in the spiritual world. Of course, words coined to describe physical circumstances can only inexactly express what takes place in the spiritual world. Taking this into account, however, it is certainly correct to say that souls who belonged together during physical life meet again in the spiritual world and continue their lives together under the circumstances of that world. The next region is the one in which the life that is common to the thought being of the entire earthly world flows and streams as the fluid element of the spiritual world, so to speak. As long as we are observing the world from the vantage point of physical embodiment, life appears bound to individual living things. In the country of spirit beings, however, life is released from individual things and flows throughout like the blood of life, as a living unity that is present in all things. During earthly life, we get only a glimmer or a reflection of this, which is expressed in any devotion we bring toward the whole, toward the unity and harmony of the world. Our religious life derives from this reflection, making us aware of the extent to which the comprehensive meaning of existence does not lie in anything individual and transitory. We come to regard transitory existence as an image or likeness of something eternal, of an harmonious whole, and we look up to this unity reverently and worshipfully in performing our religious rituals. In the country of spirit beings, however, living thought nature appears in its true form rather than as a reflection, and we can actually unite with the unity we worshipped on earth. Our religious life and everything related to it bears fruit in this region. Here, spiritual experience teaches us that our individual destinies cannot be separated from the community to which we belong, and the ability to recognize ourselves as parts of a whole develops. Religious feeling and everything in us that struggled for pure and noble morality during our lifetime will draw strength from this region during the greater part of the interval we spend in it, and we are then re-embodied with our abilities enhanced in this regard. In the first region, we were in the company of the souls to whom we were most closely linked in the physical world in our previous lifetime. In the second region, we come into the presence of all those with whom we felt united in a wider sense through a common devotion, a common faith, and so on. It must be emphasized that our spiritual experiences in preceding regions continue in the next. So we are not torn out of the context of family, friends, and so on when we take part in the life of the second and successive regions. The regions of the country of spirit beings are not separate, quote, departments, close quote. They interpenetrate each other. We experience being in a new region, not because we have entered it in any outward way, but because we have, only now, acquired the inner ability to perceive something that has been surrounding us all the time. The third region of the country of spirit beings contains the archetypes of the soul world. Everything that lives in that world is present here as a living thought being. We find here the archetypes of desires, wishes, emotions, and so on. But no self-seeking clings to the soul here in the spirit world. Just as all life constitutes a unity in the second region, all desires, wishes, pleasures, and displeasures form a unity in this third region, so that what others wish and desire is indistinguishable from what I wish and desire. The sensations and feelings of all beings form a common world that encloses and surrounds everything else, like the air that surrounds the earth. This region is, so to speak, the atmosphere, in quotes, of the country of spirit beings. Everything done during earthly life in the service of the common good and in selfless devotion to our fellow human beings will bear fruit here in this third region, because by living in service and devotion we were already living in its reflection. Humankind's great benefactors, devoted individuals who perform great services for their communities, acquired their ability to do so in this region, after having prepared themselves for a special relationship to it in earlier lifetimes. Obviously, the three regions of spirit country that have been described so far relate in a particular way to the worlds below, to the physical and soul worlds, in that they contain the archetypes or living thought beings that assume physical or soul existence in the other two worlds. The fourth region is the first that is pure spirit country, although not in the fullest sense of the word. It differs from the three lower regions in that they contain the archetypes of things and beings we find as givens before we ourselves intervene in these worlds. The word givens is in quotes. Our everyday life on earth is related to these transient things, which, however, direct our attention to their basis in eternity. These transient things, and also our fellow creatures, to whom we turn our selfless attention, are not there because of us. But what is in the world because of us is everything created through the arts and sciences, through technology, the state, and so on. Everything we incorporate into the world as original works of our spirit. Without our participation, no image of these things would exist in the world. The archetypes for these purely human creations are to be found in the fourth region of the country of spirit beings. Everything human beings develop during earthly life, by way of scientific accomplishments, artistic ideas and forms, and technological thinking bears fruit in this fourth region. Artists, scholars, and great inventors draw their impulses from this region during their stay in the spirit world. Here, their genius is enhanced, so that during later incarnations they can contribute still more to the further development of our civilization. But we must not imagine that this fourth region is of significance for outstanding individuals only. It is of significance for all of us. Any concerns during physical life that transcend the sphere of mundane activity, wishes and desires, have their ultimate source in this region. If we spent the interval between death and a new birth without passing through this region, in the next life we would have no interests reaching beyond the narrow circumference of our own personal life to universal human concerns. As it has just been said, not even this region can be called, quote, pure spirit country, close quote, in the fullest sense of the word, because the condition in which we have left the earth's cultural development plays into our spiritual existence in this region. In the spiritual world, we can enjoy only the fruits of whatever our own talents and the degree of development of our ethnic group, nation, and so on have allowed us to achieve. In the still higher regions of the country of spirit beings, the human spirit is relieved of all earthly bonds and ascends to a purely spiritual world, where it experiences the intentions and goals it established for earthly life. Everything that is actually achieved in the world brings these highest goals and intentions into existence only in the form of a relatively feeble copy. Every crystal, every tree, every animal, and also everything we accomplish through our own creativity, all these provide only copies of what the Spirit intended. During our incarnations, all we can do is link up with these imperfect copies of perfect intentions and goals. We ourselves can only be copies or imitations of what the kingdom of the Spirit intended us to be. Therefore, what we actually are as spirits in the country of spirit beings is only evident once we have reached the fifth region of spirit country during the interval between two incarnations. Here we are really ourselves. We are what assumes outer existence in our various incarnations. In this region, our true human self, the self that appears anew in each incarnation, can come to full expression. Since it brings with it abilities that have matured in the spirit world's lower regions, it carries the fruits of earlier lifetimes over into succeeding ones. It is the vehicle for the results of earlier incarnations. When the self is in the fifth region of the country of spirit beings, it dwells in the kingdom of intentions and goals. In the fifth region, like an architect who learns from imperfections that have become evident, and who includes in future designs only what he or she has been able to perfect, the self discards any of the results of experience in earlier lifetimes that have to do with lower worldly imperfections. It is now at home with the intentions of the country of spirit beings, and fructifies them with the results of earlier lifetimes. Clearly, the strength that can be drawn from this region depends on the extent to which the embodied self has achieved results that are fit to be taken up into the world of intentions. A self that has attempted to realize the intentions of the Spirit by means of its active thought life or wise and loving work during earthly life will be a good candidate for this region. On the other hand, nothing that is totally given over to mundane circumstances, nothing that dwells on and in transitory things, can sow seeds capable of playing any role in the purposes of the eternal order of the world. Only those few things that have had an effect extending beyond everyday interests can develop into fruit in these upper regions of the country of spirit beings. However, we must not imagine that worldly renown or any such thing is what is meant here. It is, rather, a question of anything, even in the most restrictive life situation, that leads to an awareness of each single thing's importance in the eternal progressive course of existence. In this region, we become accustomed to assessing things differently than we were able to do in physical life. For instance, if we have acquired very little that relates to this fifth region, we feel an urgent need to imprint on ourselves an impulse that will cause our next life to run its course in such a way that the effect of this deficit becomes apparent in the destiny or karma we meet. The, quote, unfortunate fate, close quote, to put it in terms of that lifetime, that meets us there, and that may even provoke bitter complaining, appears in the fifth region as exactly what we need. Since in this fifth region we are dwelling in our true self, we are raised above everything lower worldly that enveloped us during our incarnations. Here we are what we always have been and always will be in the course of our incarnations. We are living under the authority of the intentions that exist for these incarnations, intentions that we incorporate into our own self. That is, we look back on our past and are aware that everything we have experienced is being absorbed into intentions that we will have to realize in future. A certain capacity to remember earlier lifetimes, as well as a prophetic preview of later ones, flares up. We know that what this book calls the, quote, spirit self, close quote, to the extent that it is already developed, is in its own element in this region, where it continues to develop and prepares itself to be able to fulfill spiritual intentions in earthly reality in a new incarnation. If, through a series of sojourns in the country of spirit beings, this spirit self has developed to the point where it can move about totally freely there, it will seek its true home there more and more in times to come. Life in the spirit becomes as familiar to it as life in physical reality is to earthly human beings. At this stage of development, the viewpoint of the spiritual world begins to prevail as the one the self chooses more or less consciously as the standard for its earthly lives to come. It feels itself to be a member of the world's divine order, and the laws and limitations of earthly life do not touch its innermost being. The strength needed for everything that it carries out comes from the spiritual world. But this spiritual world is a unity, and those who live in it know that the eternal has worked to create the past. they are also able to determine their future direction in accordance with the eternal. Their view, once restricted to the past, has expanded and become perfect. There's a footnote, rather long. The statement that, quote, they are also able to determine their future direction in accordance with the eternal, close quote, is intended to point to the special character of the soul's constitution during the time between death and a new birth. By the standards of life in the physical world, a stroke of destiny in the life of an individual may seem to be in direct conflict with what that person wants and intends. During life between death and birth, however, a will-like force that prevails in the human soul points the way for the person in question to experience that very blow of fate. The soul perceives, as it were, an imperfection clinging to it from previous earthly lives as a result of some ugly deed or thought. During the interval between death and birth, a will-like impulse that arises in the soul urges it to balance out this imperfection. As a result, the soul acquires the tendency to plunge into some misfortune in its subsequent earthly life, something it must suffer in order to restore equilibrium. Once it has been born into a physical body and hit by this stroke of destiny, the soul in question has no inkling that in its pre-birth life in the spirit it had actively pushed itself in the direction of this hard fate. But in actual fact, as unwished for and unintended as this blow may seem from the viewpoint of earthly life, the soul has willed it upon itself in the course of its supersensible existence. Quote, out of eternity, human beings determine their future, close quote, end of footnote. Human beings who have reached this level provide for themselves the goals they are to achieve in their next incarnation. Working out of the country of spirit beings, such human beings influence their own future, so that it proceeds in line with what is true and spiritual. Because they have climbed to the level where they can understand divine wisdom, these human beings spend the intervals between incarnations in the presence of all the exalted beings who have an unrestricted view of that wisdom. In the sixth region of the country of spirit beings, everything that human beings do brings about what is best suited to the true and essential nature of the world. Human beings can no longer seek what is to their own advantage, but only what should happen according to the proper progression of the world order. The seventh region of the spirit world leads to the boundary of the three worlds we have discussed. Here human beings stand face to face with the, quote, kernels of life, close quote, that are transplanted from still higher worlds into these three, where they will complete their tasks. Having arrived at the limits of the three worlds, human beings recognize themselves in their own kernels of life. This means that the riddles of these three worlds have been solved for them. They have acquired a full overview of the life in these worlds. Under ordinary circumstances in physical life, the soul faculties by which we experience the spiritual world, in the way described here, do not become conscious. They work in unconscious depths on the physical organs to bring about consciousness in the physical world, and thus they remain imperceptible as far as this world is concerned. An I, E-Y-E, too, is incapable of seeing itself because of the forces that make it possible to see other things are at work in it. If we want to assess the extent to which a human life, between birth and death, is the result of earlier earthly lives, we must take into account the fact that a vantage point situated within this life itself does not allow us to do so. From this point of view, an earthly life might appear to be imperfect, full of suffering, and so on, while, to a point of view based outside earthly life, the form this life assumes in all its suffering and imperfection would prove to be the consequence of earlier lives. By setting out on the path to knowledge, as it is described in a subsequent chapter of this book, the soul can free itself from the circumstances of bodily life and perceive an image of the experiences it undergoes between death and a new birth. This type of perception makes it possible to depict the processes taking place in the spirit world, as has been done here in a sketchy form. Only when we remember that the soul's entire constitution is different in the physical body than it is when it is undergoing purely spiritual experiences, can we see these depictions in the right light. Part 5. The physical world and its connection to the worlds of souls and spirits. The formations of the soul and spirit worlds cannot be the object of outer sensory perception. Sense-perceptible objects must be reckoned as a third world alongside the other two. During bodily existence, we live in all three worlds at once. We perceive the objects of the sense-perceptible world and work on them. Soul structures work on us through their forces of sympathy and antipathy, while we ourselves stir up waves in the soul world with our likes and dislikes, wishes and desires. The spiritual nature of things, however, is reflected in our thought world, and as thinking spirit beings, we are citizens of the country of spirit beings and comrades of everything that lives in this realm. This makes it clear that the sense-perceptible world is only part of what surrounds us. It is distinct from, and to a certain extent independent of, our overall surroundings, simply because it can be perceived with senses that disregard the soul and spiritual aspects of these surroundings. It is like a piece of ice floating on water. The ice consists of the same substance as the surrounding water, but stands out because of certain qualities it possesses. In the same way, sense-perceptible things are of the same substance as the soul and spirit worlds surrounding them, but they stand out because of certain characteristics that make them perceptible to our senses. To put it somewhat figuratively, they are condensed spirit and soul formations, and the condensation makes it possible for our senses to acquire knowledge about them. Ice is just one of the manifestations of water, and sense-perceptible things are just one form in which soul and spirit beings exist. Having grasped this, we can also understand that the spirit world can change into the soul world, and the soul world into the sensory world, just as water can turn to ice. From this perspective, it also becomes clear why we human beings are able to think thoughts about sense-perceptible things. Every thinking person must ask the question, quote, what is the relationship of my thoughts about a stone to the stone itself? Close quote. For people who are able to look into nature, especially deeply, this question appears clearly to their mind's eye, EYE. They experience the world of human thoughts as being in harmony with the structure and order of nature. Kepler, the famous astronomer, put it very beautifully, quote, "The truth is that the divine calling that bids us study astronomy is inscribed on the world itself, not in words and syllables, but in the very fact that our human concepts and senses are adapted to perceive how heavenly bodies, heavenly circumstances are linked." Close quote. Footnote, Johannes Kepler, 1571 to 1630. This passage is from the, quote, commentaries, close quote, on his book Astronomia Nova, Part 2, Chapter 7. End of footnote. Only because sense-perceptible things are nothing other than condensed spirit beings, can we, human beings who can lift ourselves up in thought to the level of spirit beings, think about and understand them. Sense-perceptible things originate in the spirit world and are simply another manifestation of spirit beings. When we formulate thoughts about things, we are simply inwardly directed away from their sense-perceptible forms and toward their spiritual archetypes. Understanding an object by thinking about it is a process that can be compared to melting a solid body so that chemists can study it in its fluid form. The spiritual archetypes of the sense-perceptible world are to be found in the different regions of spirit country. In the 5th, 6th, and 7th regions, they still exist as living germinal points, while in the 4 lower regions they take shape as spiritual formations. When the human spirit tries to come to an understanding of sense-perceptible objects by means of thinking, it perceives shadowy copies or imitations of spiritual formations. In aspiring to a spiritual understanding of our surroundings, we raise the question of how spiritual formations condense into sense perceptibility. To our sensory perception, the world around us is divided into 4 clearly distinguishable levels: the mineral, plant, animal, and human levels. The mineral kingdom is perceived by means of the senses and understood by means of thinking. When we formulate a thought about a mineral object, we are dealing with 2 things: the sense-perceptible object and the thought. Accordingly, we must imagine this sense-perceptible thing as a condensed thought being. Now, one mineral entity acts outwardly on another. It bumps into it and makes it move, warms it, illuminates it, dissolves it, and so on. This outward way of working can be expressed in thoughts. In the process of having thoughts about how mineral objects influence each other in a regular and lawful manner, our isolated thoughts expand into a thought image of the whole mineral world. This thought image is a reflection of the archetype of the entire mineral sense-perceptible world, and can be found as a whole in the spiritual world. In the plant kingdom, the phenomena of growth and reproduction are added to the fact that one thing outwardly affects another. Plants grow and produce beings of the same kind, so life is added to what we encounter in the mineral kingdom. Simply pondering this state of affairs will lead us to a point of view that sheds light on the subject. Each plant possesses the inherent power to create its own living form and to pass it on to a being of its own kind. The forms of crystals stand midway between mineral substances of the formless sort, such as those we encounter in gases, liquids, and so on, and the living forms of the plant world. In crystals, we find the transition from the formless mineral world to the living capacity of the plant kingdom to produce forms. The outward sense-perceptible process of assuming shape, as it takes place in both the mineral and plant kingdoms, must be seen as a sense-perceptible condensation of a purely spiritual process that occurs when the spiritual germinal points of the three upper regions of the country of spirit beings develop into the spirit formations of the lower regions. The spiritual archetype of crystallization is the transition from a formless spirit germ point to a spiritual formation with a shape. If this transitional process condenses to the point where our senses can perceive its result, it manifests in the sense-perceptible world as the process of mineral crystallization. In the plant world, too, a spirit germ that has assumed form is present. But, in this case, the formed being retains the living sculptural ability that the crystal's spirit germ lost when it took on shape, exhausting its life in the formation it produced. In contrast, plants possess both form and the ability to go on forming. This characteristic of spirit germs is retained from the spiritual world's upper regions. Thus, a plant is both form, like the crystal, and formative force. In addition to the form that archetypal beings assume in the shape of a plant, the plant is also worked upon by another form that bears the imprint of spirit beings from the upper regions. However, the only aspect of the plant that is sense-perceptible is what expresses itself in the completed form. The formative beings that give this form its life are present within the plant kingdom without being perceptible to our senses. Our physical eyes can see a lily that is first small, then larger, but they cannot see the sculpting force that makes it grow. This sculpting force being is the invisibly active component of the plant kingdom. Spirit germs have stepped down one level in order to work in the realm of formations. If we call the archetypal forms that have not assumed specific shape the first elemental kingdom, then the force beings that are invisible to our senses and that work at sculpting the growth of plants belong to the second elemental kingdom. In the animal world, the ability to grow and reproduce is augmented by sensations and impulses. These are manifestations of the soul world. Any being endowed with them belongs to the soul world, receives impressions from it, and exerts an influence on it. Now, every sensation or impulse that comes about in an animal is brought up from the depths of the animal soul. However, the animal's form is more lasting than these sensations or impulses. We might say that the animal's sentient activity compares to its more permanent, enlivened form, as the changeable form of a plant compares to the fixed form of a crystal. The plant, so to speak, is totally taken up with the force that sculpts forms. It continues to incorporate different forms throughout its life, as it produces first roots, then leaves, then flowers, and so on. In contrast, the animal has a finished form within, which it develops Let me read that again. In contrast, the animal has a finished form within which it develops an ever-changing life of sensations and impulses. This life exists in the soul world. Plants grow and reproduce, while animals perceive, feel, and develop impulses. For the animal, these impulses are something formless that evolves through ever new forms. Ultimately, the archetypal processes of these impulses are to be found in the highest regions of the country of spirit beings, but they are active and at work in the soul world. In animals, then, in addition to the force beings invisibly at work directing growth and reproduction, others are also present that have descended one stage deeper into the soul world. In the animal kingdom, sensations and impulses are crafted by formless beings that slip into soul garments. These are the actual architects of animal forms. In spiritual science, the realm to which they belong can be called the third elemental kingdom. We human beings are equipped not only with the capabilities characteristic of plants and animals, but also with the ability to develop sensations into concepts and thoughts, and to govern our impulses with thinking. Thought, which appears as form in plants and as soul faculties in animals, appears in human beings in its real form, as thought itself. Animals are soul, human beings are spirit. The spirit being shapes the soul in an animal. In a human being, it descends one step further into the sense-perceptible world of matter itself. The spirit is present in sense-perceptible garb within the physical human body, and can thus appear only as a spirit being's shadowy reflection, as thought represents it. The spirit appears within a human being under conditions imposed by the physical organization of the human brain. However, it also becomes the inner being of a human individual. In human beings, the form assumed by the formless spirit being is thought, while in plants it assumes the guise of form, and in animals that of the soul. Therefore, to the extent that we humans are thinking beings, there is no elemental kingdom building us up from outside. Our elemental kingdom works in our sense-perceptible body, and only to the extent that we are formed and sentient beings do the elemental beings work on us in the way they work on plants and animals. Our thought organization, however, is worked on only from within our physical body. In our spiritual organs, in our nervous system, which culminates in a perfected brain, we are confronted in sense-perceptible form with what works imperceptibly as a force being on plants and animals. This means that animals feel themselves, but human beings are conscious of themselves. In animals, the spirit experiences itself as soul, but does not yet grasp itself as spirit. In human beings, however, the spirit recognizes itself as such, although physical circumstances permit it to appear only as a shadowy reflection of the spirit, as thought. Accordingly, the threefold world falls into the following subdivisions. 1. The kingdom of archetypal, formless beings, the first elemental kingdom. 2. The kingdom of form-creating beings, second elemental kingdom. 3. The kingdom of soul beings, third elemental kingdom. 4. The kingdom of created forms, crystal forms. 5. The kingdom of sense-perceptible forms, worked on by the form-creating beings, plant kingdom. The kingdom of sense-perceptible forms worked on by both the form-creating beings and the beings that express themselves as soul, animal kingdom. And finally, 7. The kingdom of sense-perceptible forms worked on by form-creating and soul beings, and in which the spirit appears in the sense-perceptible world in the form of thought, human kingdom. This demonstrates how the constitutional components of an embodied human being relate to the spiritual world. Physical body, ether body, sentient soul body, and mind-soul are to be regarded as condensations in the sense-perceptible world of archetypes in the country of spirit beings. The physical body comes about through the condensation of the human archetype to the point of sense perceptibility. So, we can also call this physical body a being of the first elemental kingdom, condensed to the level of physical perceptibility. The ether body comes about when a form of the same origin remains mobile because of a being that extends its activity into the realm of sense perceptibility, but does not become perceptible itself. To characterize this being fully, we must say that it has its ultimate origin in the highest regions of the country of spirit beings, and then takes shape in the second region as an archetype of life, which then works in the sense-perceptible world. In a similar way, the being that builds up the sensing soul body also originates in the highest spirit regions, but takes shape in the third region as an archetype of the soul world, and as such becomes active in the sense-perceptible world. The mind-soul, however, comes about when the archetype of a thinking human being assumes the form of thought in the spirit world's fourth region, and as such works directly in the sense-perceptible world. This then is how the human beings stand within the physical world, how the spirit works on our physical, ether, and soul bodies, and makes its appearance in our mind-soul. Our three lower members are thus worked upon by archetypes in the form of beings that are external to us in a certain sense. But in our mind-soul, we begin to work consciously on ourselves. The beings that work on our physical body are the same ones that shape the minerals in nature. The ones that work on our ether body are the same kind as those who live in the plant kingdom. And the ones that work on our sentient soul body are the same kind as those that are active in the animal kingdom. Both are invisible to sensory perception, but extend their influence into these kingdoms. We have now seen how the different worlds work together, and how their working together expresses itself in the world in which we human beings live. Having understood the sense-perceptible world in this way, we are also open to understanding beings different from the ones that exist within the four kingdoms of nature. One example of this type of being is what we call our folk spirit, the spirit of our ethnic group or nation. This being does not appear directly in any sense-perceptible way. It lives and expresses itself in the sensations, feelings, inclinations, and so on that we perceive as being shared by an entire ethnic group. It is a being that does not incarnate perceptibly as human beings do, but fashions its body out of the substances of the soul world. The soul body of the ethnic spirit surrounds the members of an ethnic group like a cloud in which they live. Its influence becomes apparent in the souls of the individuals in question. But it does not originate in these souls. If we do not conceive of the ethnic spirit in this way, it will remain an empty abstraction, a schematic mental image devoid of life and being. Another example of this type of being is what we call the zeitgeist, or spirit of an age. Indeed, our spiritual view widens to encompass a multitude of different higher and lower beings that live in our surroundings without becoming perceptible to our senses. However, those who are capable of spiritual perception do perceive these beings and can describe them. The lower beings of this sort include all those described by seers as salamanders, sylphs, undines, and gnomes. It should be unnecessary to mention at this point that such descriptions cannot be taken as literal depictions of the underlying reality. If they were, the world they refer to would not be a spiritual world, but a crudely physical one. In fact, they illustrate a spiritual reality that can only be described by using metaphors and images. Individuals who accept sensory perception alone as valid will believe these beings to be the product of superstition and of an imagination run wild. This is totally understandable. These beings will never become visible to physical eyes because they have no physical bodies. The superstition, however, lies not in believing these beings are real, but in believing that they appear sense-perceptibly. Beings of this sort help to build up the world, and we encounter them as soon as we enter higher territories that are inaccessible to our physical senses. The truly superstitious people are not those who take these descriptions as images of spiritual realities, but both those who believe in their actual physical existence and those who deny the spirit because they feel obliged to reject the sensory images. Beings also exist who never descend into the soul world at all, but whose garments are woven out of the configurations of the country of spirit beings. We perceive them and become their companions when our spiritual eyes and ears have been opened to them. This process enables us to understand many things we could formerly only stare at in total incomprehension. Light dawns around us. We see the causes of the effects and consequences that are played out in the physical world. We grasp things that formerly, when we lacked spiritual eyes, we either had to deny totally or dismiss with the saying, quote, "There is more in heaven and earth than is dreamt of in your philosophy." Close quote. People with a finer, that is, spiritual sensitivity grow restless when they begin to be dimly aware of the presence of a world in addition to the sense-perceptible world around them, a world they have to feel their way around in, like blind people among visible objects. Clearly recognizing these higher regions of existence and penetrating what goes on in them with understanding is the only path that can really ground us and lead us toward our true calling as human beings. Through insight into what is concealed from our senses, we expand our own being in such a way that our life prior to this expansion seems to have been spent dreaming about the world. Part 6. Thought Forms and the Human Aura. It has been said that the formations of any one of the three worlds are real for us only if we have the faculties or organs needed to perceive them. For example, certain processes taking place in space are perceptible to us as manifestations of light only because we have properly formed eyes. How much of what is real actually becomes evident to any being depends on that being's degree of receptivity. We are never justified in saying that only what we ourselves can perceive is real. Many things can be real, but we simply lack the organs to perceive them. The soul and spirit worlds are just as real as the sense-perceptible world. In fact, they are real in a much higher sense. No physical eye can see feelings and concepts, but they are real nonetheless. We encounter the phenomena of the physical world through our outer senses. Similarly, feelings, impulses, instincts, thoughts, and so on become perceptions for our spiritual organs. How these soul and spiritual phenomena become perceptions by means of our inner senses is analogous to how certain processes in space are perceived as colors. Of course, the full meaning of this statement can be understood only by those who have developed their inner senses by following the path to knowledge described in the next chapter. To such people, the soul phenomena of the soul environment and the spiritual phenomena of the spiritual region become supersensibly visible. They experience another being's feelings as raying out toward them like rays of light. When they turn their attention to others' thoughts, these thoughts radiate through spiritual space. For them, one person's thought about another person is not invisible. It is a perceptible process. The actual content of a thought exists only in the mind of the thinker, but it produces effects on the spiritual world, and it is this process that is perceptible to the spiritual eye, EYE. The thought is an actual reality streaming out from one person toward the other, and how it affects the other person is experienced as a perceptible process in the spiritual world. For someone with opened spiritual senses, then, the physically perceptible person is only one part of the whole human being. The physical person is the center of soul and spiritual streams. It is impossible to do more here than merely hint at the richly varied world that discloses itself to the seer. For example, a thought that is otherwise alive only in the listener's understanding appears as a spiritually perceptible color phenomenon, its color corresponding to the character of the thought. A thought stemming from a person's sensual impulses has a different tinge than one formulated in the service of pure knowledge, noble beauty, or eternal truth. Thoughts springing from sensual activity move through the soul world in shades of red, while a thought that elevates the thinker to a higher form of knowledge appears in a beautiful shade of light yellow. One that stems from loving devotion discloses itself in a radiant rose pink. Footnote: because these descriptions are obviously open to the crassest misinterpretation, a brief further commentary on them has been added at the end of this chapter. End of footnote. The supersensible manifestation of a thought expresses its degree of exactitude as well as its content. A thinking mind's precise thought appears as a formation with distinct contours, while a confused idea appears as a blurred and foggy formation. In this way, a person's soul and spirit nature appear as the supersensible portion of a total human being. These spiritually perceptible colors, which surround an active physical human being like an egg-shaped cloud, constitute that person's aura. The size of this aura varies from person to person, but on the average we may imagine a whole person to be about twice as tall and 4 times as broad as his or her physical body. Within the aura, streams of different colors present a true and ever-changing picture of our inner life in all its variability. However, there are also some lasting, basic colors that express specific permanent traits, talents, habits, and idiosyncrasies of character. People who are currently far from being able to experience the path to knowledge described in the next chapter are likely to misunderstand the nature of what is described here as the aura. They may imagine that the colors described here are present to our mind's eye, EYE, in the same way that physical colors are present to our physical eyes. Such soul colors, however, would be mere hallucinations. Spiritual science has absolutely nothing to do with hallucinatory impressions, and in any case, that is not what is meant by these descriptions. We can get the right idea of what is meant if we keep in mind that we not only experience a sensory impression of a physical color, but also have a soul experience that is different when our souls, by means of our eyes, perceive a yellow surface than it is when we perceive a blue one. Let us call this experience, quote, dwelling in yellow, quote, unquote, or, quote, dwelling in blue, close quote. A soul that has set out on the path to knowledge has this same experience of, quote, dwelling in yellow, close quote, when it encounters the active soul experiences of other beings, and of, quote, dwelling in blue, close quote, when it meets devotional attitudes. The point is not that seers visualizing another soul see, in quotes, blue, in the same way that they see it in the physical world, but rather that they have an experience that justifies their calling the visualization, quote, blue, close quote, just as people who are perceiving physically call a blue curtain blue, for example. Furthermore, seers must be aware that this is being experienced in a body-free state, so that they acquire the possibility of speaking about the value and significance of the soul's life in a world not perceived through the medium of the human body. The sense in which this description is intended must be kept in mind, even though seers talk as a matter of course about blue, yellow, or green in an aura. Human auras differ greatly according to individual differences in temperament, personality, and degree of spiritual development. Let me read that sentence again. Human auras differ greatly according to individual differences in temperament, personality, and degree of spiritual development. A person totally given over to animal impulses has a very different aura than someone who spends a lot of time thinking. A religious person's aura is fundamentally different from that of someone who is totally caught up in trivial daily events. In addition, all of a person's changing moods, inclinations, pleasures, and pains are expressed in his or her aura. To learn what different shades of color in the aura signify, we must compare the auras of different types of mental and emotional experiences. We will first look at inner experiences that are penetrated through and through by pronounced emotions. These experiences can be separated into two different types. In one type, the soul is driven to these emotions primarily through the person's animal nature. In the other type, emotions assume a more refined form because they are strongly influenced by thinking and deliberation, so to speak. In the first type of experience, the streams of color flowing through particular parts of the aura are primarily various shades of brown and reddish yellow. In people with more refined emotions, shades of lighter reddish yellow and also green appear in the same places. It can be noted that shades of green appear more frequently with increasing intelligence. People who are highly intelligent but devote themselves totally to satisfying their animal impulses have a lot of green in their aura. But this green always has a more or less pronounced tinge of brown or brownish red. A large part of the aura of unintelligent people is flooded with streams that are brownish red or even dark blood red. The auras of emotional states, such as these, are fundamentally different from those of calm, contemplative, thoughtful moods. There, fewer brownish and reddish tones are present, and various shades of green become more pronounced. During strenuous thinking, the aura's basic color becomes a pleasing green. This is especially prominent in personalities who are said to be able to adjust to practically any situation in life. Shades of blue appear during moods of devotion. The more people place themselves in the service of a cause, the more pronounced these shades of blue become. In this connection, too, we may encounter two very different types of people. The first type consists of passive people who are not used to exerting their powers of thought, who have only their good nature to throw into the flow of world events, so to speak. Their auras glimmer with a beautiful blue. This is also how many devotedly religious personalities appear, as do compassionate natures and people who devote themselves to leading a life of benevolence. If such people are also intelligent, blue streams alternate with green, or the blue itself takes on a greenish cast. In contrast to more passive personalities, more active people typically have their blue suffused from within with light, bright tones. This is most clearly the case in personalities we would call wise, and especially in those who are full of fruitful ideas. In addition, everything that points to intellectual or spiritual activity generally takes the form of rays spreading out from within, while everything originating in animal vitality assumes the form of irregular clouds rolling through the aura. According to whether the ideas that result from our emotional or mental activity serve our personal animalistic impulses or ideal and objective interests, the coloring of the corresponding auric formations will differ. An inventive mind that applies all its thoughts to satisfying its own sensuous passions shows dark shades of blue and red, while one that selflessly places its ideas at the service of an objective interest shows light red-blue tones. A life in the spirit that combines with noble devotion and capacity for self-sacrifice shows rosy pink or light violet colors. However, not only our underlying attitudes, but also our transient emotions, moods, and other inner experiences are present as floods of color in our auras. A sudden outbreak of violent anger produces floods of red. A sudden upwelling of offended dignity appears as dark green clouds. And these color phenomena appear not only in irregular cloud-like formations, but also in figures of regular form and distinct limits. In the aura of a person suddenly seized with fear, we notice wavy stripes of blue with a reddish-blue shimmer moving from top to bottom. The aura of someone who is tensely awaiting some particular event has red-blue stripes constantly radiating from inside outward. Someone capable of precise spiritual perception can distinguish each impression another person receives from outside. People who get excited about every external impression have a constant flickering of little blue and red spots and flecks in their aura, while people who perceive less vividly have similar flecks that are yellow-orange or a lovely yellow color. The auras of so-called absent-minded people have bluish or blue-green specks of more or less variable shape. Within the auric streams and rays surrounding a person, 3 different types of color phenomena are distinguishable to the more highly developed spiritual eye, EYE. The first type of color is relatively dull and opaque in character, although even it seems fleeting and transparent in comparison to the type of color seen by our physical eyes. Within the spiritual world itself, however, these colors make the space they occupy comparatively opaque, as if they were filling it with figures of mist. The second type of color is all light, so to speak. These colors light up the space they occupy, so that it too becomes all light. But the third type of color phenomenon is totally different from the other 2 in its radiating, sparkling, glittering character. These colors do not simply fill the space they light up, they shine and radiate right through it. There is something active and inwardly mobile about them, as if they were constantly creating themselves from within, while the other colors have something quieter and more lackluster about them. Figuratively speaking, the first 2 types of color fill space with a delicate fluid that quietly stays put, while the third type fills it with constantly self-enkindling life and unceasing activity. These 3 color types are not arranged in distinct layers in the human aura, nor do they occupy separate areas of space. Instead, they interpenetrate in a great variety of ways. It is possible to watch all 3 kinds mixing and mingling in the same place in the aura, just as a physical object such as a bell can be both seen and heard at the same time. This means that the aura is actually an incredibly complex phenomenon, because we are actually dealing with 3 interpenetrating auras. However, we can sort things out by turning our supersensible attention to only one of the 3 at a time. This is similar to shutting our eyes while listening intently to a piece of music in the sense-perceptible world. Seers have 3 different organs for the 3 kinds of color, so to speak, and can open one of them to impressions while closing the other 2 for the sake of undisturbed observation. To begin with, some seers may be able to see only one aura, while the others remain invisible. Others are receptive to the first 2 types, but not to the third. The ability to observe all 3 auras and to direct one's attention to one at a time for purposes of study constitutes the higher stage of seership. The threefold human aura is the supersensibly perceptible expression of the three components of the human being's essential nature: body, soul, and spirit. The first aura reflects the body's influence on the soul. The second represents the soul's own life that extends beyond direct sensory stimulation, but is not yet devoted to the service of the eternal. The third reflects the immortal spirit's degree of mastery over the transitory aspect of human nature. It must be emphasized at this point that since these things are even more difficult to describe than they are to observe, this and any other attempt to describe auras should never be taken as anything more than a stimulus to understanding. Thus, to a seer, the idiosyncrasies of an individual's inner life are expressed in that person's auric makeup. Any emotional or mental activity that is totally given over to sensuous impulses, fleeting desires, and momentary external stimuli shows up as garish colors in the first aura, while the second is weakly developed, showing mere traces of colored forms. In a case like this, the third aura is barely visible. Only a flicker of color here and there indicates that even in a person with this attitude, the eternal is present in the form of potentials, even though it may be suppressed by the effect of sensory factors. The more a person rids him or herself of physical urges, the less prominent the first part of the aura becomes. Meanwhile, the second part becomes larger and larger, filling the body of colors within which the physical human being dwells with its radiating energy. And the more a person proves to be a servant of the eternal, the more the third part of the aura is revealed, showing the extent to which that individual is a citizen of the spiritual world. Through this part of the aura, an individual's divine self radiates into the earthly world. To the extent that individuals give evidence of this aura, they are flames used by the divinity to enlighten this world. Through this part of the aura, they show the extent to which they work out of the eternally true, beautiful, and good, rather than out of themselves. The extent to which they have wrested from their narrower selves the capacity to offer themselves up on the great altar of cosmic activity. Thus, what individuals have made of themselves in the course of their incarnations comes to expression in their auras. All three parts of the aura contain many different shades of colors, whose quality changes with an individual's degree of development. In the first portion, a person's undeveloped life of urges and impulses is seen in shades that range from red to blue. These shades are dull and opaque in quality. Pronounced shades of red point to sensual desires, lust, and the pleasures of the palate. Shades of green appear primarily in characters with a tendency to apathy and indifference, lower natures who give themselves up greedily to any pleasures that come along, but avoid the personal effort it would take to satisfy them. When a person's passions are intent on some goal beyond the reach of his or her acquired abilities, brownish-green and yellowish-green tints appear in the aura. This type of aura is fostered by certain modern lifestyles. The lowest level of egotism, personal vanity rooted in low inclinations, is revealed in muddy yellow to brown tones. But, of course, a life of animalistic urges also has a positive side. Even within the animal kingdom, a pure and natural capacity for self-sacrifice, of which instinctive mother love is the most beautiful and highest expression, is evident to a great extent. Such selfless natural urges are expressed in the first aura in shades of light red to rose, while cowardly trepidation and a timid response to sensory stimuli show up as blue, with a brownish or grayish cast. Various grades of color are also apparent in the second aura. Brown and orange forms express strongly developed vanity, pride, and ambition. Red and yellow flecks point to curiosity. Green expresses an understanding of life and the world, while pale green reflects clear thinking and intelligence. Children who learn easily have a lot of green in this part of their auras. A greenish-yellow coloring in the second aura points to a good memory. Rose pink indicates loving and benevolent wisdom, while blue is a sign of piety, verging on violet as this piety approaches religious fervor. Idealism and a serious, elevated outlook on life are seen as indigo blue. In the third aura, the primary colors are yellow, green, and blue. Here, light yellow appears when thinking is filled with elevated and comprehensive ideas that grasp the place of details in the divine order of the universe. In the case of intuitive thinking that has been purified of all sensory images, the yellow acquires a golden glow. Green expresses love for all beings. Blue is the sign of willingness to make sacrifices for the sake of all. If this capacity for sacrifice intensifies into a forceful will that places itself actively in the service of the world, the blue becomes a light violet. If pride and ambition are still present as remnants of personal egotism in an otherwise highly developed soul, shades verging on orange appear in addition to the yellow. It is important to note, however, that the colors in this part of the aura are very different from the shades we are used to seeing in the sense-perceptible world. The beauty and sublimity that meets us here cannot be compared to anything in the ordinary world. This description of the aura cannot be properly assessed by anyone who does not place primary importance on the fact that seeing auras signifies an expansion and enrichment of our perception in the physical world. The intent of this expanded perception is to recognize that form of soul life which possesses spiritual reality outside of the sense-perceptible world. What has been presented here has nothing to do with reading a person's thoughts or character from an hallucinatory aura and wants no dealings with this questionable art. Its intent is to expand our understanding in the direction of the spiritual world. Addendum to Chapter 3. Of all the chapters in this book, this one on, quote, thought forms and the human aura, close quote, is probably the one most open to misinterpretation by opinions to the contrary, the one to which the most objections can be raised. For instance, it would be quite understandable to insist that a seer's statements in this field be proved by experiments in line with scientific thinking, such as having a number of people who claim to be able to see spiritual auras stand face to face with a number of subjects whose auras they allow to work on them. These seers should then report what thoughts, feelings, and so on they saw in the auras of the people they observed. If their reports agree, and if it turns out that their subjects really did have the feelings and thoughts ascribed to them, belief in the existence of auras would seem reasonable. This is certainly the scientific way to look at the issue. But something else must be taken into consideration. Spiritual researchers' work on their own souls gives them the capacity for spiritual vision. That is the point of their efforts. But whether they are then able to perceive something in the spiritual world in any given instance, and exactly what they perceive, does not depend on them, but comes to meet them as a gift from the spiritual world. They cannot force it. They have to wait until it comes. Their intent to perceive spiritually is never the real cause of it happening, although that is what science would assume in the case of this experiment. The spiritual world will not allow itself to be bossed around. If this experiment were to come about at all, it would have to be initiated by the spiritual world, by a spiritual being's intention to reveal the thoughts of one or more subjects to one or more seers. A spiritual impulse would have to bring these seers together to carry out the observation, in which case their reports would be sure to agree. As paradoxical as it may seem to a strictly scientific mind, this is the fact of the matter. Spiritual experiments cannot come about in the same way as physical ones. If clairvoyants are visited by people they do not know, it cannot simply be assumed that they will be able to see the stranger's auras. It is not a matter of deliberate intent. They will be able to see them if and when there is a reason for it in the spiritual world. The point of these few words is to draw attention to the misconception inherent in the objection described above. Spiritual science is meant to describe how people can learn to see and experience the reality of auras for themselves. All it can say to those who seek this knowledge is, quote, "Apply these prerequisites to yourselves, and you too will see." Close quote. It would certainly be more expedient if the demands of scientific thinking could be met, but those who require proofs of this sort have not familiarized themselves with even the most elementary results of spiritual science. This book's statements about the human aura are not intended to accommodate spiritual sensation seekers, who will be satisfied only by being presented with something, quote, "spiritual," close quote, that can be conceived of no differently than something physical. That is, when they can rest content in the sense world with their usual ideas. What was said at the beginning of this chapter about how auric color is to be imagined was surely calculated to prevent misunderstandings of this sort. But anyone who aspires to genuine spiritual insight has to realize that direct experience of matters of spirit and soul involves seeing the aura spiritually rather than sensorially. Without spiritual perception, the experience remains unconscious. We must not confuse the experience itself with its expression in pictorial form, but we must realize that the experience is very adequately expressed in this pictorial view. It is not something the perceiving soul makes up arbitrarily. It takes shape of itself in supersensible perception. Scientists may be forgiven if they find themselves compelled to describe a human aura of some sort, as Dr. Moritz Benedict does in his book on the rod and pendulum theory. Quote, "There are a small number of people who are adapted to seeing in the dark. Of this minority, a relatively large percentage can see many objects in darkness, but without colors, and only relatively few also see in colors. My two classic cases of seeing in the dark examined a considerable number of scholars and physicians. In my darkroom, and these subjects were left with no justifiable doubt as to the accuracy of their observations and descriptions. People who see colors in the dark see the front of the forehead and scalp, as well as the rest of the right-hand side in blue, while the left side is seen as red, or sometimes yellow and orange. The division and coloring are the same when seen from behind." End of quote. Footnote, Moritz Benedict, 1835 to 1920, physician. His book Ruten und Pendellere, The Rod and the Pendulum, was published in Vienna in 1917. This quotation is from page 17, end of footnote. Spiritual scientists, however, will not be forgiven so easily if they talk about auras. But this author's intention is neither to take any kind of position on Benedict's report, which is one of the most interesting in the annals of modern science, nor to grab at any flimsy opportunity to justify spiritual science by means of the natural sciences. His intent is only to point out how in one case someone investigating natural phenomena can make claims that are not totally dissimilar to those of spiritual science. It should be emphasized, however, that the aura discussed in this book is to be grasped by spiritual means. It is something completely different from the one Benedict is talking about, which can be studied by physical means. We would be surrendering to a gross illusion if we were to believe that spiritual auras could be investigated by any outer scientific methods. They are only accessible to the spiritual vision acquired on the path to knowledge described in the last chapter of this book. To recapitulate, the idea that the truth of spiritual perception can be verified in the same way that the truth of physical perception can is based on a total misunderstanding. That is the end of the addendum and the end of chapter 3.